and doing what Carter really would like to have done, except for the political consequences as far as the hostages were concerned.
Do you think that the Shah was the President gem of the latter day, that the United States openly or covertly destabilized him?
I would say that as far as what happened to the Shah is concerned, that I think the Shah's own appraisal of what brought him down is the best evidence. I saw the Shah the last time in Mexico, at Cuernavaca, Mexico. He was then in the last phases of terminal cancer, although he would never admit it or talk about his own problems at all. But he was quite thin and quite pale. But his head still as active and sharp as it had always been. He's a very intelligent, introspective man. And he said that what concerned him about the way he was treated by the United States was not that the United States was for him or against him, but was the uncertainty of the policy. He says there's nothing worse when you are confronted with revolutionary and rebel forces than uncertainty insofar as support is concerned. One day, for example, he said statements would come in, public and private, from Washington indicating total support and urging him to stand firm. The next day, there would be some story leaked from a high-level aide, printed all over the world and given particular credence in Tehran, to the effect that lower-level or second-level people in the administration were meeting with Khomeini and others who were out to knock the Shah off or out, as the case might be. And then the next day, there would be a story to the effect that in the event that the Shah left Iran or was overthrown, the United States would be prepared to accept any government that the people chose. Well, he said all of this had the effect of encouraging his enemies and, of course, discouraging his own supporters. He said that was a mistake. And I believe it was a mistake, too. As a matter of fact, what happened to the Shah, I think, could only be interpreted in that part of the world and other parts of the world as well, is that it is dangerous to be a friend of the United States, and it may pay to be an enemy. I think what we have to understand is that the Shah was the best friend of the United States in that area, in the whole Persian Gulf area, and it was Israel's only friend. The Shah, we must remember, in the 1973 war, furnished oil for our Mediterranean fleet when the other countries in the area had cut it off. And the Shah tied down the Iraqi forces by supporting the Kurds against the Iraqis so that they never got involved in the 73 war. And I know that the Shah, when he spoke in Mexico about what had happened, that he could not understand why it was that among his critics in the American media, there were some of Jewish background, not all, but some who were among his most violent critics because they were liberals and they thought he was too reactionary and the rest. And he just couldn't understand that because he was the only friend that Israel had in that whole area of the world.
Why did you go to his funeral?
First, because I knew him better than any world leader I have met over the past 37 years of public life in and out of it. I met him first back in 1953 when I was a young vice president and he was a very young Shah in his early 30s. And I met him over 10 or 12 times after that. I found him to be a very sensitive man, a very intelligent man, one who understood the world as well as any leader that I had met, who could talk about India or Pakistan or China or Latin America with, frankly, as much perception and sophistication as any American leader could possibly talk about it. And I had great respect for him. And I think the major reason I went, though, I must say, was because I was concerned that our own government, again, I suppose, because of the hostage situation, was not going to be represented at the funeral by a high-level person.
Were you concerned that your going might embarrass President Carter?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, it occurred to me that President Carter probably deep down wished he could have gone, but he couldn't. He didn't feel that he could because of the hostage situation. No, I went because the Shah was my friend, He was a friend of the United States, and I thought that some high-level individual from the United States ought to be there. You see, the important thing that we've got to get across to the people in countries that are wavering between standing with us or going in the other direction or remaining neutral is that the United States is not a fair weather friend, that we will stand by our friends and allies when they are down as well as when they are up. Now that may not make good diplomacy, but I think it in the short run, but in the long term, I think it's absolutely essential if we're going to build the kind of support and respect and confidence in the United States that we need to have.
The Shah is generally accepted as having been a very repressive and oppressive ruler. His Savak tortured and killed. He lived in considerable splendor and opulence while there was terrible poverty in his country. In your book, Leaders, you write that he was not ruthless enough in quashing those who threatened his nation's stability. Do you think he should have been more ruthless?
Yes, I do, particularly in view of the fact that his opponents were not those who were basically more liberal, but because basically they were reactionary. They were the true reactionaries. Let's look at the Shah for just a moment and look at him very fairly. He actually was a progressive in a number of ways. He instituted a land reform program. He instituted a literacy program. He sent thousands of students from Iran to the United States, and particularly the United States, to study, and in other countries as well. He liberated women. The irony was that those he liberated, the women and the students he sent abroad, they came back and joined the revolutionary forces. And the irony was that the Shah, being progressive, was attacked as being reactionary and conservative on these particular issues, whereas his opponents were the reactionaries. Putting it very bluntly and very simply, the Shah was trying to move Iran into the 20th century. His opponents, Khomeini et al., wanted to move Iran back into the Dark Ages, and that's what they've done. Now there was some repression, true. Now there is total repression. There may not have been enough land reform. Now there is none whatever. What I am simply suggesting is this, that when we look at the Shah, we have to look at him in terms of what he confronted. And he confronted revolutionary forces there that were not working, in my view, for what was best for Iran and certainly not best for ourselves. And most important from the United States standpoint, instead of having a friend in Iran, we now have one that is not only not a friend, but one that considers us to be the great Satan.
Can you say that if you had stayed in office that you would not have allowed the Shah to fall?
I would not have, no. I would have been steadfast throughout. I would have made it very clear down through the bureaucracy that there was to be absolutely no contact with those that were trying to overthrow him. I would have had a very good study made of Khomeini's background and would have found that exactly what kind of person it was, because by studying his background, they could have known that he was going to do exactly what he's going to do. The man is a radical reactionary. He's not a progressive in any sense of the word.
If you had been...
See, the choice basically was not between the Shah and somebody better. The choice was between him and somebody worse. And it's very easy for me to make that choice.
If you had been confronted with the worst case from that point of view, and the Shah had been overthrown and hostages taken, and you were president, would you have taken him into the United States?
Absolutely. I would have taken him into the United States, and as far as the hostages are concerned, I would have handled that a little differently too. I don't say this in criticism of President Carter, because he certainly went through a lot on the hostage situation. He believes it may have cost him the election. I don't think it did. I think the economic issues were the major ones. But be that as it may, it didn't help him. But as far as the hostage situation was concerned, American foreign policy can never be made hostage to hostages. That's why hostages are taken, for purposes of blackmail. And we mustn't let that happen. And for example, when President Carter was asked about the hostage situation, he went overboard in saying that our first and then only concern was the safety of the hostages. Now, that is a concern, but our major concern is what happens to Iran, what happens to the relations between the United States and Iran. And in this respect, I would never have said, as President Carter did, that I rule out the use of force in order to get the hostages back. All that did was to encourage those that had captured them and were holding them in captivity not to give them up. I remember President Eisenhower during our administration and the vice presidential days used to say on occasion that he had learned as a military commander that it's very important never to tell your enemy what you're going to do, because then he'll be ready for you. But he says it's just important never to tell him what you're not going to do, because then that will encourage him to do things he otherwise might not do. And in this case, that was a mistake, in my view, to do that. The other thing I would say is that with regard to the hostage rescue operation, that President Carter and the Pentagon, I assume they are the ones that joined in the decision, made a mistake and are not, again, following out an Eisenhower dictum. And that dictum is that when you make a play of that sort, you always assume the worst. And you cannot assume that your intelligence is going to be absolutely accurate. I have a very interesting reaction in that respect that Eisenhower had at the time of Lebanon in 1958. As everybody will recall, in 1958 in Lebanon, there was a crisis because the government there was under attack. There was a possibility that the Soviet Union might intervene, and Eisenhower had to make a decision as to whether or not to send Marines in order to establish peace. And I remember the briefing that occurred in the Oval Office, and Eisenhower heard Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, and Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, brief him and to recommend that we send in a Marine group in order to keep order. And when they gave their report, they indicated that they did not think there would be any intervention from the standpoint of the Russians, and that it would be a peaceful operation. And Eisenhower sat back, and after they had given this report, he said, "Foster, let me ask you something. Let us assume our intelligence is wrong. Are you prepared to take the next step?" And Foster Dulles thought a long time. He said, "Well, Mr. President, I'm 90% sure that there will be no problem. But if there is, yes, we should be prepared to take the next step." The point of that anecdote is that Eisenhower would never have made the mistake of the Bay of Pigs. When the intelligence proved to be wrong, there wasn't the uprising that they had hoped at the time, and when it was necessary to have committed more air strength than had been planned, or at least not to cut back on what had been planned. In other words, in the hostage situation, rather than sending enough helicopters plus one, you should say send twice the number to be sure that if there were, as there turned out to be, mechanical or other difficulties, you'd be prepared to carry out the operation to a successful conclusion.
If you had still been in office, would you have taken the risk of the rescue mission?
Oh, yes. Oh, I think President Carter deserves high marks for taking that risk. I took a similar risk somewhat during the Vietnam War. We had the Son Tay operation, where we had intelligence reports with regard to a prison camp for our POWs, and we sent in a magnificently trained group to rescue them. It came off after all the training and so forth that they had and the support we gave them, it came off perfectly. Unfortunately, they had moved the POWs from the camp and it was found empty.
Did you direct that they follow that worst case dictum and send
Oh,
them
yes.
twice as
We were
many
ready.
as- yeah.
Oh, yes, we were ready. In fact, we lost a helicopter too, but there were plenty there. And as a matter of fact, we lost no men on it because we were prepared. No, that didn't fail because of lack of preparation or because of lack of equipment. That failed only because our intelligence was faulty in terms of not finding out that the POWs had been moved from that camp to a place in Hanoi.
In practical political terms, could you have resisted the tremendous domestic feeling and pressure against the Shah at the time if you had been in office and had invited him into this country? Wouldn't that have created almost an unmanageable national uproar?
It might have, but I would still have done it because in the long term, a president on occasion has to stand against what appears to be the best opinion of the brightest and the best in the media, who of course would try to create that uproar. And I would not say that you would find that when the American people really realized what the stakes were, that they would have opposed what the president did in that respect. I think in retrospect, the American people perhaps would respect the president for doing what he felt was right and what was in the interest of the country. I must say, I was quite moved by the fact that after I went to the Shah's funeral, I went at my own expense, of course, and took this long trip and came back, that I received a great volume of mail from the United States, from all over the world as well, saying, thank you very much for standing by a friend. Now, I'm not sure that's the majority opinion, but in any event, there's still a lot of support in the world and in the United States for doing the right thing, even though it has some political costs.
Do you think that the government should have picked up the tab for your going to the Shah's funeral to represent the country as you did, even unofficially?
Absolutely not. I never asked the government to do that. For
But
example,
do you think they should have offered?
No, they wouldn't. I wouldn't expect them to, because basically, if they were to pick up the tab for that, why didn't they send me on an official mission? No. As a matter of fact, in all of my travels abroad, I don't ask for government support. Secret Service has to go on by law, but for example, my several trips to China since I've been out of office, my trips to the Mideast, and also my trips over to Europe have all been at my own expense. I want to be, if you go as the representative of the government, then of course you have to do what the government wants, and I want to be independent to do whatever I want, to say whatever I want when I come back.
Would you accept a government mission if you were asked to take one?
No, if I thought it would be appropriate. For example, let me say I was a member of the delegation that went to Sadat's funeral, and we rode in a government plane down there. From Sadat's funeral, however, I did not stay. I did not come back with Ford and Carter on the plane. I went on around to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco after I had attended the funeral. I did that at my own expense.
There's a great story about that they didn't know that you were going to peel off and go off on your own, and that when they found out you were gone was when the door was about to close and they looked around and found you weren't there. Did you plan to shake them up a little bit by just disappearing?
No, I didn't plan to shake them up, but I couldn't inform them that I was going to make this kind of a trip, since it was being done on my own, and I couldn't inform them without getting involved in a lot of diplomatic double talk and so forth and so on. But I did inform, let me make it very clear, I did inform the Secretary Haig, because the State Department did furnish me briefing materials for the trip, but I did not want the trip. Let me explain. The major reason I couldn't inform them is it wouldn't have been proper before going to a funeral and before the funeral was completed to announce that after the funeral I'm going to go visit other countries in the area, particularly when the other countries in the area, none of them at that particular time had good relations with Sadat, and none of them had attended the funeral. So I had to wait until after the funeral and then just to take off.
Do you think that if President Sadat had been dealing with anyone other than Prime Minister Begin, that he could have achieved a broader, more comprehensive peace settlement?
Doubtful. President Sadat didn't think so. We've referred to his various abilities, his intelligence and his determination and his vision, etc. He was also a pragmatist. I remember the last time I saw him at his suite here in New York on his last visit to the United States. Begin at that time was pretty low in American public opinion because I think that was right after he'd bombed the Iraqi reactor or something like that. And People were referring to him as being crazy. In fact, there was a column that morning in one of the papers saying he was crazy. And I said, what do you think, Mr. President? Is this Begin crazy? He says, oh, he's crazy, but he's crazy like a fox. And I said, wouldn't you prefer to have somebody else to deal with, somebody who would be perhaps easier to deal with and not as intransigent and difficult as he apparently was at Camp David? He thought a moment. He says, oh, no. He says, I prefer to deal with him. He's tough and he's strong, but I know that once we make the deal, he will be able to deliver on it. And I says, I'm not sure that some of the others would. So I would say that as far as Begin is concerned, it'll be hard to make a deal with him, particularly when he says that Galilee and Samaria belong to Israel and so forth. But on the other hand, once he makes it, he is certainly one that can get support from it. Because those who oppose a deal in Israel are not the liberals, but the conservatives, and Begin, of course, represents them.
Some observers say that because of Begin's aggressive and tough and as some people see it, unpleasant personal characteristics, he does Israel's cause harm with United States public opinion. Do you think that's true?
I think he does in many respects. For example, I do not think that if it had been Golda Meir or Rabin, that the whole Lebanese operation would have received the bad press that it did in the United States that it did with Begin, because Begin was so hard-nosed and tough all the way through. On the other hand, there's a lot of grudging respect for him, too, in this country. I mean, this country doesn't like to lose. This country likes to see another nation stand up for its rights. And so under the circumstances, I think Begin has some support. But I think in overall terms, his personality was not particularly a pleasant one for most Americans, particularly when Israel was engaged in what many considered to be was inconsistent with Israel's basic ideals.
Some observers feel that President Sadat was naive in his policies. The distinguished Arab journalist Mohammed Haikal says that he was naive in that when he traded Russian support for American support, he confined himself to having to negotiate to Israel. And even Henry Kissinger, apropos Sadat's throwing the Soviets out in 1972, said he should have let us know in advance. We would have paid him well for it. How sophisticated was Sadat in planning his policies, thinking them through?
I never think of Sadat as being a particularly sophisticated person. He's intelligent, but I think he is a man who sometimes is moved by impulse. I think what happened when he flew to Jerusalem, he just decided that there was a bottleneck there, that a big play was required. It was risk for him, but he believed in taking risks for peace. It's very important for all of us to remember that it takes courage to fight war, but it also takes courage, a different kind of courage, to wage peace. Sadat understood that. He was willing to take risks for peace, and it paid off. I think as far as the Russians were concerned, what happened there is that one of the reasons that he had them leave, as he told me when I saw him in 1974, he says, we just gave up on them. We gave up on them because they weren't providing the economic and military support that he thought that they had promised. And let me emphasize, too, that Sadat was influenced to a certain extent, I am sure, and maybe to a great extent, by Faisal, because Faisal was very anti-Soviet. And Faisal constantly remonstrated with Sadat with regard to having too much Russian influence in Egypt and tried to wean him away, and that played a role as well. So maybe it's just possible that Sadat should have played it in a tougher way and have said that the United States had to pay a price in order for him to throw the Russians out. But that was characteristic of Sadat. He did what he thought it was right, and incidentally, it was the right decision. Let me say another thing that set up Sadat's doing what he did with regard to renewing relations with the United States. That occurred because Sadat was convinced after the 73 war, where you've got to understand the United States supported Israel with an airlift at a time that Israel was about ready to be overrun by the Egyptians and the Syrians. That nevertheless, he, very shortly after that, the ceasefire ended that war, resumed diplomatic relations with the United States. And I think he did that because he realized that the United States could do something for him in terms of peace that the Russians were unable to do in terms of waging war. And he also did that because he was convinced that while there was no question about my being pro-Israel, he felt that being pro-Israel, as far as I was concerned, did not mean that I would be anti-Arab or anti-Egypt. As a matter of fact, he had a very candid talk with me on that '74 trip about the American political scene. He'd followed our elections pretty closely. And he realized that, except for Eisenhower, I was the only American president since World War II who had been elected without substantial Jewish support. He felt that I would support Israel, but he thought I would not be unfair to Egypt or anti-Arab as a result of that support. And he was right. That's why those are among the factors that got him to move as he did.
On that last trip, the 1974 trip, did he mention Watergate to you at all?
He did not mention it, but his wife, interestingly enough, spoke to Mrs. Nixon about Watergate. Now understand, this is before Camp David, before the so-called détente between Egypt and Israel. But she said that they in Egypt just couldn't understand Watergate at all, and that they thought it was a conspiracy, and that she and many Egyptians thought it was a Jewish conspiracy. I don't think that was the case, incidentally, but that does show that there was still a strong anti-Jewish sentiment back in 1974, which of course still is there to an extent, but changed by the new relationship created by Camp David.
How did Mrs. Nixon handle a diplomatic confidence of that nature?
Well, she handles it very properly. She listens and she nods and, of course, does not make comments of her own because she wasn't asked to.
There's a very vivid film of you and Sadat standing by the pyramids on that '74 trip. Do you remember that scene? Was it as dramatic to live it as it is to watch it?
I had been to the pyramids before, but being there with Sadat, of course, was a different kind of experience, different in kind particularly, even though the place was the same. And as you stand there, you think of Egypt's past, which is a great past. We think of China being an old country and the Chinese having an old civilization. And Egypt goes back much older. It's one of the oldest civilizations in the world, 2,000 or 3,000 years older in terms of history than even China. And as you look at the pyramids, you think of modern-day Egypt, a terribly, terribly poor country, overpopulated, but people with a great potential, The Egyptians are the educators, or at least that's been my observation, the educators of the whole Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean, Mideastern area. And Sadat was trying desperately to move Egypt up economically. He died, unfortunately, before much progress had been made in that direction. But as we stood there in the pyramids, you naturally think of the past, and you think that a man like Sadat and those who follow him, like Mubarak, that they also must think of their past. Every time they look out their windows and see the pyramids and think of the greatness of Egypt in the past, that must renew their dedication, their determination to build a bigger and better Egypt in the future.
We've reached the end of our hour. Do you remember that it was hot as hell and your leg hurt?
Oh, yes. We get that in another place, if you're going to the
no.
I had the phlebitis in terms of another compact.
I think for the fade out on this, the picture of the film of standing with the pyramids in the background, and that I think the way you did it is just right for ending the Sadat the story. And we got the Shah in. He was a little out of order, but we got him in good, yeah.
Well, the main thing, the line, it's dangerous. Dangerous to be a friend of the United States. It pays to be an enemy. Summarizes it all. Be sure that stays in. You see, that's a kind of a quote that people can understand. Don't you agree?
Yes. Yes, we got Middle Eastern food in honor of our, we have the sheep's eye for you, Mr. President.
That'll be the day.
Chinese food for the Chinese.
That's right. Wait till we talk about Tibet.
Mid-Eastern food, we'd all sleep right after. Really heavy.
We tried to get white shark for the because of the people who ate the lunch, there may be
Keep your eyes on me, Franklin.
Burp.
Count down, and I'll cue you. And then you
Is
can
it some burps, you mean?
no, there may be a steady flow of people out to the
Can.
head.
stand by.
Okay, 10 seconds out.
Over the years, you met King Faisal several times, both in Saudi Arabia and in the United States. What kind of a leader was he?
I would have to rate him very, very high. Without question, he was the ablest leader of the Arab world that I've ever met. And I would rate him in terms of all the leaders I've met. And I met perhaps over 300 heads of government and heads of state over the past 37 years. I'd put him in the top 10. He's that good.
Did he have a sophisticated understanding of the forces throughout the world, or just in his region?
That was the reason that I would rate him so well. He was one who knew his country and knew it well. But he was one also who knew the world. He knew Europe, he knew America, he knew Asia. He could talk as well about other countries and other areas of the world as he did the Mideast. And he also had a deep appreciation of the East-West conflict. He had one hang-up, however, on which we did not agree. He always referred to the Zionist communist conspiracy, even though the Soviet Union, it seemed to me, was trying to do Israel in, as he would have liked to have done it in too on occasion. But apart from that, he was a very clear thinker, and he played a great role, of course, when he helped to wean Sadat away from the Russians, one for which we should always be grateful to him.
Did his belief in this Zionist communist conspiracy unbalance his judgment, do you think?
Not to the point that, for example, he couldn't receive me. After the war of 1973, I had strongly supported Israel. We had saved Israel from defeat, certainly, or helped to save it through the airlift and through keeping the Russians out. But he appreciated the fact, as he told me, that while he knew and understood that I was pro-Israel, that I was an American president that was not, because I was pro-Israel, anti-Arab. And all that he asked for was that the United States have an understanding of the Arab world, an appreciation. And that's why we developed a good relationship. I would say further with regard to Faisal, he was two different men, as I remember him. I met him first when he was, I think, Minister of Finance in King Saud's government. And he was in New York at the Waldorf Astoria. I was in New York at the same time. And I found that he would like to get together for a meeting. And he was dressed in Western clothes and spoke impeccable English and so forth, and spoke about his concern about Mideast relations and so forth. Then when I saw him in 1974, he was king then, and he looked altogether different, sounded altogether different. He wore the heavy Arab gowns that the men wear, the crown. He spoke only Arabic, never English. He was totally a man of the Saudi Arabian country empire at that time. He was a man, basically, who was two kinds and two different people in another sense. He was a progressive in terms that he wanted to move Saudi Arabia into the 20th century. But on the other hand, he was conservative in the best sense. He wanted to retain the best of the past. That's why he wanted to retain basically Saudi Arabian culture and religion. And it was a very intelligent thing to do because rather than making the mistake that some leaders in that area have made of rooting out the past so that people don't have any roots in the past, keeping the best that is in the past and building on that, he avoided the rebellion that might have occurred by if they thought they were being moved too fast into the modern.
King Faisal had rather an unhappy, almost forbidding countenance. What was he like as a man?
Well, again, it depends what period of time we're talking about. He's very different. When he was in his Western clothes in the Waldorf, he was basically a man of the West. And then there in his own kingdom, he was as Arab as any Arab as I've ever seen. He was a man that seldom smiled. I remember one of his friends told me that whenever King Faisal smiled, it was like as if someone had bitten into a lemon and found it to be sweet. He was also, incidentally, and this always impresses anybody who meets with somebody else, he was a very good listener. One of his favorite quotations was that God gave men 2 ears and 1 mouth. And the reason was that men were supposed to listen twice as much as they talked. But he not only used the proverb, he practiced it himself. And there's nothing that impresses the other fellow more than when you listen to what he has to say rather than insist that you got to do the talking.
Do you think that he intended the oil embargo during the 1973 war to have the revolutionary and revolutionizing effect on the West, and particularly on America and the American economy, that it did?
I think that he must have had very mixed emotions about it. He felt he had no choice but to do that in view of the fact that the United States had gone all out in support of Israel against the Egyptians and against the Syrians. And after all, Saudi Arabia at that time and at the present time supports those countries as against Israel. I think, however, that we have to give him credit for attempting to mitigate the effect of that embargo at a later time. In fact, Saudi Arabia and its oil minister Yamani were very, very helpful in getting the embargo removed eventually, but certainly moderated at a later time.
How would you describe the effect of both long-term and short-term on the United States of the Arab oil embargo in 1973?
Well, it was very detrimental in terms of the perception that Americans have of Saudi Arabia, the other oil-producing countries. After all, we don't like to sit in gas lines and have the price of gasoline go up and go through all the things that we did during that embargo. And of course, I was president at that time, and I've noted recently that they've got several billion ration tickets that they've now have to destroy because I wouldn't let rationing go ahead, thank God, when some were recommending it in the administration. But nevertheless, that perception of the Saudi Arabians as being basically anti-American, which was really not it so much as they're anti-Israeli. And I think Saudi Arabia, we have to recognize too, had another problem. Saudi Arabia is not a very populous country. It's a very big country and it's a very rich country. But almost half its population is Palestinian. And so under the circumstances, I think Faisal felt that the embargo had to go forward or the Palestinians had been in an uproar.
Do you think that the results of the oil embargo contributed to your downfall a year later?
Well, a number of things contributed to it. It didn't help. In fact, the fact that the recession began to develop, The oil embargo, of course, created more inflation, and that combined with the worldwide food shortage in 1973, 1974, helped to create the inflation, which later led to the recession. So it contributed to it, probably.
You met King Faisal when you were in the Mideast on your tour in 1974. Did you talk to him about the possibility that you might not survive in office in terms of what would happen with American policy in the Middle East, or did he raise it?
No, he didn't raise that. That just left, he just left that unsaid. I was consequently very surprised when we met the press after our formal talks, and he stepped right up to that issue in a way that left little to the imagination. He first praised me quite fulsomely, and perhaps more than he should have, in terms of what my policies had done toward producing peace in the world, peace and progress, as he called it. And he said, I urge all Americans and all people in other countries to support President Nixon in the greatest initiative toward peace in world history, one of the greatest certainly. And then he went on to say, and those in America and those in other parts of the world who oppose him are in effect opposing the cause of peace. And he concluded it by saying, and he said, Mr. President, so hand in hand and shoulder to shoulder we will go forward together in working for a world in which there will be peace and progress and justice. Well, it had quite an impact in the press corps because by that time, I think many of them, understandably, not only were against me, but they were hoping that everybody else would be as well, and were waiting for the day for the downfall. But it didn't help him. And the point is that as far as Faisal was concerned, he could have buttered up to the press by saying nothing, or even still giving a little jab in terms of my problem being my own and being rather harmful to relations. But his standing up the way he did was just the kind of a man he was.
The House of Saud seems to enjoy special prestige and success. What do you think it is that sets it apart from the other ruling houses or the other rulers in the Middle East?
Well, one thing that sets it apart is that they're very rich. They're the richest country in the Mideast, but it's more than that. Basically, Saudi Arabia is the religious center of the Mideast. And also, in looking at Faisal and in looking also at his predecessors, Khalid and Saud, whatever we want to say about them, they were deeply, profoundly religious men. The same, of course, is true of Fahd, who is now king, and a man also whom I knew very well and very favorably. Met him in Washington first when he was not even crown prince, just a minister, and then met him later when he was crown prince, and I've been in correspondence with him since he has ascended the throne. That's part of the reason. The other reason is that the Saudis have played, because of their wealth, a very significant role with other countries. After all, they subsidize, or did subsidize the Egyptians. That's one of the reasons Faisal had great influence with Sadat, but they subsidize the other Arab governments to a very substantial amount and therefore can influence them. Now, I must say, there are those, and understandably in this country and other parts of the world, who think that the Saudis are much too cautious, that they'll never step up to anything. But I would only suggest that the reason that they are that way is that whoever is king in Saudi Arabia is sitting on basically a potential explosive situation due to the fact that there's such a heavy proportion of the population which is Palestinian and potentially radical. But above all, I think the reason that the present House of Saud has prestige far beyond the population of the country is not so much its money, but because while it supports progress for the future, it has not made the mistake of rooting out the past. And therefore, its progress is going to be built on the solid culture that the Saudis think is very important to them and to the other countries in the Arab world.
How would you describe the American stake in Saudi Arabia?
Well, the stake, of course, is enormous due to the fact that Saudi Arabia has not only present oil, but also great reserves in oil, which are among the greatest in the world. Now, that is important to us, but it is indispensable to Japan and indispensable to most of Europe, except for the British, of course, who now have North Sea oil. At the time, for example, of the embargo, one of the reasons in 1973, one of the reasons that our European friends didn't want to go along on that, and of course didn't, is that they were mortally afraid of the effect that an embargo would have on them. Now, the United States, if an embargo were to come, if, for example, Saudi Arabia and the other oil-producing states in the Persian Gulf were cut off from us, if that supply were cut off, we could get along. It'd be tough, but we could. Japan could not, and much of Western Europe could not. So therefore, Saudi Arabia holds the oil pipeline, which is essential for the manufacturing capabilities of much of Europe and of Japan, and to an extent of the United States.
Are there circumstances in which America would go and fight to protect that pipeline if it were threatened?
Well, I think one of the reasons that after the Afghan invasion by the Soviet Union, President Carter announced the doctrine for that part of the world that the United States would be prepared to intervene and asked for approval by the Congress, and approval was given for a force which would be available in the area to handle such contingencies. I would say that certainly the United States is developing that kind of capability. Now, when the question is asked as to whether or not we would go to war in order to save our oil pipeline, I think that poses a very difficult one. I'm not prepared to say what others would do. I certainly would suggest that our European friends, the Japanese, and the United States would have such an enormous stake there that we could not stand by and allow that whole area to come under control of a power that would be antagonistic to us.
When you were president, would you have sent in troops if that were the case, if it were threatened, say, by the Soviets?
They would certainly think so. It isn't the question of whether people thought that I would, but as far as the Soviet were concerned, they weren't about to make a move of that sort, particularly after what I had done in Vietnam. I had proved my credibility by taking the risks we did politically in the invasion of Cambodia, as it was called, the May 8th bombing and mining of Haiphong, the bombing in December of 1972. All of these things create credibility, and I do not think that the Soviet Union would have tried to test me in that way. But there was another reason, too. We have to recall that with all of the problems of so-called détente, that the very fact that summit meetings were going on an annual basis deterred the Soviet Union from engaging in aggressive conduct in that part of the world or any other part of the world that might be detrimental to the interests between the two countries.
Do you remember how you heard about the assassination of King Faisal?
Oh yes, I read it in a news report. It didn't, which had come in the morning. That was all I.
You've written in your book that he was perhaps the only modern leader assassinated by or because of television. What did you mean by that?
Well, the irony in Faisal's case was that, as I have often pointed out, he was a progressive in the sense that he had a great program for literacy. He abolished slavery. He provided education for women. And of course, a great program because they had the funds for it to build hospitals and roads and schools and all that sort of thing. He moved this basically nomadic desert empire into the position of being a modern state. On the other hand, deep down, he was a conservative. And deep down, and he has told me this in our conversations, he didn't like television. He thought it was a corrupting influence. But also, as a pragmatist, he realized that many of the younger people in Saudi Arabia did like it, but also he realized that if Saudi Arabia were going to be a modern state, it had to go forward with some of these modern appliances. And what happened was, the irony of it all, was that he, one who opposed television, was assassinated by an extremist who was opposed to having any television in Saudi Arabia. So he is the first, and I hope the last, leader who has lost his life because of television, having in mind the fact that it shouldn't have happened to him. Let me say, incidentally, that brings up another very important point to make, which many people miss. When people think of Faisal, and when they think of Sadat, and they think of the Shah, and those who oppose them, most liberals jump to the conclusion that the Shah was forced out of power, and that Faisal was assassinated and Sadat was assassinated because they may have been too conservative. It's just the other way around. In all cases, in the case of the Shah, it was not the liberals who drove him from power. It were those who wanted to turn the clock back. In the case of Faisal, it was a conservative, reactionary who assassinated him, and the same was the case of Sadat. I remember Faisal, even he did not see the danger, that the real danger was not on the left but on the right. I recall he expressed great concern to me when I was there about his own Air Force. He said that many of his young Air Force pilots had been trained in the United States, and he had sensed that many of them had come back inoculated, as he thought, with the virus of Western liberalism. And he feared that therefore they might engage in, frankly, revolutionary activities. It didn't work out that way. He lost his life not because the left opposed him, but because the right did, even though he was more on the right than he was on the left. And I think throughout that part of the world, we should make another observation. We can speak of the danger of communism in that part of the world, and it is not to be certainly underestimated, because the communists will always come to power and they'll always profit from chaos, and there's a lot of chaos out there. And they'll do what they can to pick up the small change even in the way that they usually do. But on the other hand, if there were no communism, if Russia didn't even exist and was not trying to move into that part of the world, there would still be a major problem. The problem is on the right, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. You will find that as far as the opposition forces to those governments, all of which are so-called, quote, moderate governments, the opposition forces are forces that are on the right, like the revolution in Iran. As a matter of fact, I would say the most destabilizing potential force in the Mideast today is not Soviet-supported activities, but the kind of attitudes and activities and so forth that are represented by Khomeini in Iran and by Gaddafi in Syria. I mean, by Gaddafi in Libya.
How do you think history will assess King Faisal's role and contribution?
Oh, far better than his contemporaries. It has to assess him well, because he was a big man. I mean, on the world, and incidentally, I am not alone in this appraisal. Many other leaders have told me, they don't say it publicly as I do, but they had enormous respect for Faisal. I'll put it this way, he's one of the few men in the world that was worth traveling 8,000 miles to see. He's just worth talking to because he was so intelligent and had the wisdom that he did. But I think they will appreciate him in this respect, that he recognized in that part of the world, which is so backward, which needs progress, he recognized the need for progress and supported it, for liberating women, for moving ahead on the literacy problem, for moving ahead in all the areas of industrialization and so forth. But he also recognized that in building the new future, you must also retain the best of the past.
On your June 1974 trip to the Middle East, you went for the first time to Syria, a country that you hadn't visited before. What were your first impressions of your first visit to Syria?
Well, a lot different than the background that I had received with regard to what Syria might be like. I don't mean the briefing paper said this, but much of what I'd read in the press and some people who had been there or observed it, they always referred to the crazy Syrians and that this fellow Assad was a bit of a nut, totally irrational. You couldn't do anything with him and so forth. And that another thing that was said was that there was no country in the world which was more anti-American than Syria. And so consequently, when the trip was laid on and we went to Syria after being in Saudi Arabia, I was a little concerned about the kind of reception we would get. And I remember sitting in the cabin of the plane making some notes for the arrival. And all of a sudden, the plane really gave a lurch, and I thought we'd hit an air pocket. The pilot came back, and he said, there's some Soviet jets out there. And I looked, and sure enough, they were buzzing the plane. Well, we were relieved when he found out that while they were Soviet jets, they were operated by Syrian pilots, and that they were simply an escort to escort us into the airport. So we arrived there in Damascus. And I must say it was one of the most fascinating places I've ever visited. I had not known until this trip that Damascus is the oldest continually populated city in the world. I'd known it from this description in the Bible. I had not known that it went back that far. And I must say, as contrasted to the anti-Americanism that was expected, or I expected, they were very pro-American. The people would clap when we came out of meetings. They lined the streets, although there wasn't a great deal of publicity about our being there and so forth. I think, however, it posed quite a problem to Assad because I remember he told me after he had witnessed, after we'd ridden in from the airport and saw these people on the side there, he said, I hope you noted the warm welcome you received. And I said, I did. He said, well, it does pose a problem, Stephen. And then he told me what had happened when he had talked to his 8-year-old son just after we came in. And his 8-year-old son had seen me shaking hands with Assad at the airport. He said, Father, he said, how possibly could you do that? He said, isn't that Nixon, the Zionist you were shaking hands with? That evil man who sided with Israel against us in the Jordan War in 1970? The man who saved Israel with the airlift in 1973? How could you possibly shake hands with him? And Assad went on to say, he said, you got to understand, even though he's only 8, that as far as our children in this country, they have been taught to hate capitalism, they have been taught to hate America, and particularly they've been taught to hate Nixon, because Nixon is the one that sided with Israel and also helped Israel in 1973 and avoided a defeat that we otherwise would have inflicted upon them. And then he said, I replied to my son with one of our favorite proverbs, better for the blind man to see with one eye than not to see at all. Now the question is, why would Assad, after all of this propaganda, anti-American propaganda, why would he want to tilt his policy a bit more our way? And I think the reason is that deep down, Assad and the Syrians are not pro-Russian. They like the Americans a lot better. They'd like to have a foot in our camp as well. They depend upon the Russians, but that is the reason that he, I think, was glad to see us there, and he welcomed the opportunity to agree, as we did agree, to a resumption of relations, and particularly to economic cooperation, which unfortunately has aborted considerably since we left.
One of the other leaders in that region that you have known for many years from his time as a very young man is King Hussein. What are your impressions, or what do you remember from your various meetings with King Hussein?
Well, before getting to that, it's another interesting thing to note that in both Egypt and Syria, we had a very interesting reaction in terms of the difference between the Russians and the Americans. And I got this report from Manolo Sanchez, who worked for us and who accompanied me on the trip. And Sanchez would go into the kitchens and check the food and that sort of thing, and talk to some of the people and the waiters and so forth and cooks. And he said that in Syria, he said when he went in there, they said, "Thank God the Americans here. Now we hope the Russians go." And he said they didn't like the Russians because the Russians were lived apart and they were sour and mean. And when we got there to Egypt, he ran into exactly the same thing. And Assad told us that the Americans made more friends in 6 months, because we had renewed relations, of course, in 1973 after the 73 war, than the Russians had made in 6 years. And I think what it had to do with was the way Americans conduct themselves abroad. Whether rightly or wrongly, we are very friendly people. We're very outgoing people. And the Russians were dour under their communist rules and so forth. They weren't allowed to fraternize. And so we have something going for us in that respect. Well, with regard to Hussein, he has been described as a survivor, and he certainly is. I've known him for 25 years. He came to the Eisenhower White House, and then I have known him off and on through the years, both there and in his own country. And he is a man, first, of great intelligence. He's very shrewd and politically. But he is a man who is sitting on a powder keg because, again, about half of his people are Palestinian background. And in fact, as far as the Jordanians are concerned, if he is to survive as king, he's got to get along with both. And that is why he has to be more cautious than some in the West would like him to be. They want him to step up there and run over to Jerusalem right away. Well, if he does that right away without getting some sort of better understanding with regard to relations in the future, and as far as the West Bank is concerned, he's going to risk physical or political suicide or both. Another thing about him that many are not aware of in the West is that he's an enormously courageous man. I'm referring to it not politically primarily, but particularly physically. For example, in 1970, when there were very serious problems within Jordan, groups rebelling, particularly Palestinian types, he led the lead tank himself and operated it. He is absolutely fearless. And when his critics say that he isn't fearless enough in making some sort of agreement with Israel and stepping forth, I would say better to have him there as a moderate leader, which he is, as one who is not anti-Israel, and that's true of him as well, than to have him out of there and have a radical Palestinian in charge in Jordan. Let's don't push him to take action until he gets something from Israel that will be understood by his own people.
How would you describe King Hassan?
Hassan of Morocco is quite an outstanding leader in his own right as well. Let's first understand that Morocco is a very important country. It isn't recognized as being important as it is, not simply because it is basically a Muslim or Arab country, which it is. Because of its location, Morocco is one of the most strategically important countries in the world. It borders on the Straits of Gibraltar. It is a bridge between Africa and Europe. It is also a bridge between the Arab world and the rest of Africa, and the Arab world and the Mideast. And so under the circumstances, it's a very important country. Now, coming to him himself, I met him for the first time in 1957. I was a young vice president then, traveling in that area, and he was a very young crown prince. And his father, who was then the Sultan, later became Mohammed V, the king of Morocco, had his crown prince accompany me as we drove through the streets of Casablanca and Rabat and these other cities. There were thousands and thousands of people out. I followed my usual practice that I had in my vice presidential days of stopping the car from time to time and moving into the crowds and shaking hands and going into the bazaars and the coffee shops. Now, many times when I did that when I was in other countries, the people just didn't understand it. I mean, the people I was traveling with, but not him. He loved doing it himself. He mingled with the people, and he still does now that he is king. Another thing happened on that trip that was very interesting. It rained for the first time in a year, and they'd had a terrible drought. And that night, the king of Morocco, King Hassan, Mohammed V, the father of the present king, proposed a toast to me. And he said, "To the man with the green feet." That means wherever he walks, the grass grows. And I understand that's about the best toast you can get. The other point of interest insofar as the background is concerned is that when his father, Mohammed V, came to the United States in 1957 for his state visit, that was the only occasion in 8 years that I ever was the host at a White House dinner. And that was because that was the day that President Eisenhower had his stroke. So that night, I was the host of the dinner along with Mrs. Eisenhower. Now that King Hassan has grown up, he's no longer a young prince. He is now a mature king. I would evaluate him this way. Highly intelligent, but I think one of the most impressive things about him is that he has a better understanding of Europe and European politics than any Arab leader that I have met, with the possible exception of Faisal. Faisal would be about equal. He's very sophisticated. He travels a lot in Europe. And he handles the situation within his own country, I think, quite well. He has the Polisaros who are rebelling against him. But instead of going out and fighting them in their turf out in those deserts, he's taken the best part of the disputed Spanish Sahara. He's built a wall around it and stays behind the wall. It's one of the few walls in history that has worked.
How would you describe President Bourguiba?
Bourguiba is one of the real survivors in the area. He's been in power as long as anybody can remember. Very charismatic, very outspoken, very warm and friendly. When I visited him last in 1982, he threw his arms around me. He was so glad to see me because I had seen him also in 1957. And he is very courageous in terms of Arab-Israeli relations. He is one of the first of the Arab leaders who began to make moves toward a more moderate stance toward Israel. And he's done that even though in his country, in Tunis, they have a problem as far as the radical right is concerned. Bourguiba in Tunis has the radical right. They are his danger. His danger is not on the left. Hassan's danger is on the right, not the left. This is interesting to say about Hassan. Hassan has been thought of as a very rich, which he is, monarch, living very well, which he does. And you would think that therefore his danger would be on the liberals, on the left. But his danger is not there because he is progressive in terms of trying to move the country into the modern era. His danger is on the right. Those who want to move Morocco back, as, for example, Khamenei has moved Iran back. And it's to our interest, above everything else, to do everything we can to see that leaders like Hassan and like Bourguiba and like the King of Jordan and, of course, the Saudis, that they have as much support as we possibly can so that moving our way will demonstrate to the peoples of those countries that that's a better way than moving back, as Khamenei has moved the Iranians.
If these Arab leaders are so great and so important and influential, why is it that they are either unknown to most Americans or that they're thought of as sort of grown men wearing bed sheets?
Well, part of it is at their own fault. They have been very inept in terms of their public relations. They have not demonstrated the understanding of the United States and particularly our media that they should. They come over here and hire high-priced PR firms who don't understand it either, and just take their money and pocket it, and I feel in many cases don't do much good for them, although there are some exceptions, of course. Another reason, we have to be very candid about it, is that this country is basically very supportive of Israel. And it is generally assumed that Arab leaders are opposed to Israel. Now, that's not true of the King of Morocco, despite some of the impressions that it's not true of Bourguiba. It's not true of the King of Jordan. It is true, certainly, of the Saudis. They are very strongly anti-Israel. But on the other hand, the fact that so many Americans have been indoctrinated the idea that to be pro-Arab means that you're anti-Israel, I think causes some of the problem. And that's simply got to change, because these are men that deserve certainly a better hearing insofar as the United States are concerned. I'd say further that one impression that I made in my toast in Saudi Arabia, and I followed this same theme, the toasts in the other countries that I visited on that trip in 1974, and again when I went back last year, I constantly made the point that I was pro-Israel. I mean, I didn't duck that because they all know that. But I made the point that being pro-Israel doesn't mean that you're anti-Arab. And then I made this point, and this, I think, touched them. I said, it is not natural for Americans and Arabs to be enemies. It is natural for us to be friends. They appreciate that, and I believe that. And I think that if we can just get that across, and then if we can some way take some of the poison out of the Israeli Arab antagonism by finding some even halfway solution for the West Bank, providing some kind of self-government, diffusing that issue so that it can't be exploited by the radicals on the right or by the Soviet Union, that is going to change the whole Arab world in terms of its perception in the United States.
Do you think that if the Arabs had better or more sophisticated public relations, that American support for Israel might be changed or attenuated?
I'm not very high, I never have been, on public relations moves. Public relations firms, I know they're necessary. I think sometimes they're a necessary evil, and some of my very good friends operate them. But generally speaking, as far as that particular matter is concerned, it's essential for these countries themselves and their leaders to understand America. The most effective proponent of any of these countries in the United States is the man himself, as they perceive him. He is the one who can best present a proper image of America. I'm just sorry, for example, that Faisal has passed from the scene. If he had been able to come to the United States, as he would have if he had lived, and certainly if I had survived, he'd have been there very fast. But if he'd been able to come to the United States with his sophistication, with his wisdom and so forth, he, with one visit, could have substantially altered the perception of the Western world, and particularly of the United States. And let's get another example of that. Sadat. Now, one of the reasons Sadat, who was the only leader of that part of the world except for Israelis, many of whom have been in the top 10, the only reason he has been in the top 10 of those most admired in the world among Americans who answered the poll, the reason was, first, that he had gone to Jerusalem, and therefore he was not considered to be anti-Israel. But second, because of his personality, people were able to see him. He's a charismatic figure. And consequently, I think it's very important for some of these leaders to be exposed to the American public, but to be exposed under circumstances where they can present their own case. Hussein does a good job in that respect, incidentally. Handles himself well, part of the reason being, of course, that he speaks English. But it'll take some time to work this out. But we've got to defuse the Palestinian-Israeli thing before there's going to be widespread acceptance of these Arab leaders for what they really are, that they aren't just a bunch of nuts wearing bed sheets and so forth and so on. They are different from us, and we should not try to change their cultures or their religions. They like theirs and we like ours. But on the other hand, we got to recognize they go their way, we go ours, and as I've often said, it's not natural for Americans and Arabs to be enemies. Let us be friends.
What's your opinion of Yasser Arafat?
I do not know him, except from what I've seen on television and what I read in the newspapers. But I think I could best describe him as being a cat on a hot tin roof. He's jumping all over the place. And the reason is that he sits on what is called the PLO. There are various segments of that. Now, many people have painted him as being a moderate among the Palestinians. Deep down, perhaps he wants to be, and deep down he knows that's the best way to get some kind of acceptance by Israel of some kind of self-government in the West Bank. But on the other hand, he cannot cut the umbilical cord with what he's called his hardcore, the al-Fatah group. And the moment that he, for example, made any kind of conciliatory statements with regard to Hussein being allowed to join the talks on the Reagan plan for the West Bank, the al-Fatah group raised hell with him, and he had to back off because their only answer is to wage war. Now, he's obviously an intelligent man. He knows that waging war has not worked for them as was any time, and it certainly didn't work the last time when the Israelis wiped them out in Lebanon. But while he is, I would say, a cat then on a hot tin roof, he also is a cat with 9 lives, because how he's able to survive out there in that hotbed of intrigue and differences and so forth, it's hard to say.
Do you think that the Israelis lost moral stature by the invasion of Lebanon and the Beirut massacre?
Before going into that, I think it's important to really tackle the subject that's often raised. I mean, you say, why don't we talk to Arafat? Why don't we talk to the PLO? And the answer is we can't. We can't because, like it or not, we have cast our lot with and for Israel. And they're not recognizing Israel means they're not recognizing us. And so therefore, unless till they do that, it would be a mortal affront to Israel for us to deal with the PLO. However, there is another ground. We should try to influence them. And I say we in the broadest sense of the word. We should not object to our European friends and our friends in the Arab world, particularly the Saudis, talking to Arafat. In fact, we should encourage it, having in mind the fact that maybe over a period of time, he and the Palestinians can be moved away from the totally intransigent line that they have at the present time.
Do you think that the Israelis lost moral stature, or how much moral stature did they lose by the invasion of Lebanon and the massacre in Beirut?
Immediately after the massacre, it seemed like it had been almost a death blow. But since then, as it's gotten to more perspective, and since then, when the Israelis faced up to the problem and had a very extensive inquiry, which resulted in the defense minister, Sharon, having to resign his post and being appointed to another one, of course, I think that that has tended to mitigate the strong feeling in the West, and particularly in the United States, that they had lost moral stature, that they were as bad as their enemies, in effect, by condoning or seeming to condone or allowing to happen the terrible massacre that occurred, even though it could be excused, maybe not excused, but certainly understood, having in mind the fact that millions of Jews were massacred in Germany, or in Poland, and in Europe, and so forth and so on. One massacre doesn't make, which is wrong, doesn't make another one right, and they know that. I think what has happened here is that among many of Israel's younger people, as well as some of the thoughtful older ones, there is a feeling, a deep-set feelings that this policy of continuing war in the long run is going to be disastrous to what Israel wants to be, what it means to itself and what it means to the world. That if Israel is going to continue to have to fight its neighbors, then war inevitably leads to repression. War basically is a brutal, brutal business. It results in killings, and when you let that beast out, sometimes massacres occur, just as it did with us, with Miley, although we, of course, reprimanded and prosecuted those who were engaged in it. Let me describe it this way. The massacre there was not something that the Israelis approved. They might have avoided it. But it isn't like the situation with the North Vietnamese in Vietnam. There, the killing of civilians, assassination, murder, rape, everything, that was a matter of policy. This was not a matter of policy. This was opposed to Israeli policy, and that's a big difference. So I'd say that as far as this is concerned, this has set a lot of Israelis to thinking about the future of their country, as it should. And in my view, we're going to have more things like that in the future, because it is one of the fallouts from war, are events of this sort. And so therefore, we have to take some risks for peace rather than just continuing to be involved in war.
Did you ever have second thoughts or doubts or concerns about the effectiveness of Henry Kissinger, a Jewish Secretary of State, formulating Mideast policy for your administration?
Well, there were many who thought it was a great mistake at the time he was appointed. But I had great confidence in Henry Kissinger because I knew that he was fair-minded. I knew, too, that while there was no question about his being devoted to the survival of Israel, that he thought in geopolitical terms, and that he felt it was very important to support my policy, which has been mine throughout my public life. My policy, which is we stand for Israel, we will support Israel, but that does not mean that we will not also seek better relations with the Arabs states. And Henry carried that out extremely well. For example, on his shuttle trips, we developed closer relations with Egypt, even to a certain extent with Syria, and with some of the other countries. Now, I must say, there are some out there who don't trust him because he is Jewish. I think, however, they're mistaken in that respect.
Aren't there also some who don't trust him because they feel that he said different things to different people in the different countries?
That is correct. I have heard that. And maybe that's just one of the costs of being a diplomat.
Why is it that the U.S. State Department is considered to be pro-Arab and throughout your administration thwarted, in some cases, directly or indirectly, some of your pro-Israeli Middle Eastern initiatives? Wouldn't one expect the foreign policy establishment as represented in the State Department to be pro-Israeli?
Well, first of all, the State Department is not just one entity. The State Department is made up of individual Foreign Service officers, and there's some over there that are very pro-Israeli. The majority of them, as are the great majority of those in the Pentagon, however, are pro-Arab as well, and I emphasize that point. The State Department people, and I think the Pentagon people too, are not pro-Arab and therefore anti-Israeli. But they feel it is very important that for geopolitical reasons that the United States not alienate 100 million Arabs, particularly when they sit on as much of the strategic oil of the world as they do. And even apart from that, if there were no oil there at all, that's a lot of people. And they cover a lot of important territory, the gateway to Africa, the gateway to the Indian Ocean, etc. And so I think, too, in defense of some of the State Department people who may be called the Arabist, we have to have in mind they believe, as I believe, that it is vitally important from Israel's standpoint that the United States have good relations with Israel's neighbors rather than bad relations, because we will restrain their neighbors. The Soviet Union, if we leave a vacuum, would not. It would egg them on. So that's the way I would look at it.
Do you think that there can ever be a truly bipartisan American Mideastern policy given the
I want to do a pickup on that question. We hit your microphone, and I got a bad sound. I want to change the question.
Okay.
Switch 2 on the line. I'm sorry, switch 1 on the line. Okay, go ahead.
Do you think that there can ever be a truly bipartisan American foreign policy given the constraints of American domestic politics regarding the Mideast?
Well, generally speaking, Democratic candidates will get a very heavy majority of the Jewish vote. Republican candidates simply don't. Eisenhower's highest percentage of the Jewish vote was about 38% in 1956. My highest percentage of the Jewish vote was 32% in 1972. At a time, I got about 68% of the non-Jewish vote in the country. President Reagan got about 36, 35, 36% in his landslide in 1980. He won't get that much the next time around due to the fact that people probably feel that a Democratic candidate will be more pro-Israeli than Reagan, although Reagan is, as I have pointed out to many of our friends in the Jewish community, is the most, in my view, the most pro-Israeli president in the White House, deep down in his heart, since Harry Truman. Not that Eisenhower was...
Since you.
In my case, I was, but on the other hand, in my case, it is well known that one of the reasons I was able to take a situation in 1969 in which we had no relations with Egypt and some of the other countries because of what happened in the '67 war, and reestablished a dialogue with the Arabs and so forth. I was never considered to be simply one who was going to give a blank check to Israel, and some Jewish voters resented that. It was a case of all or nothing. Now understand, most of the intelligent ones don't think that way. They know who was Israel's friend when it counted, and Golda Meir was one of my best press agents in that respect. But on the other hand, there is a tendency among Jewish voters to be far more pro-Israel than Israel's leaders, because with them it's all black or white. Now when you come down to it at the present time, you take Reagan compared with the Democratic candidates, he's not going to be able to outpromise any of them with the Jewish voters. So consequently they will be that way. Now another reason that Jewish voters in this country tend to be more for a Democrat than a Republican is that Jewish voters generally are more liberal. The Democratic Party is more liberal than the Republican Party. So under the circumstances, therefore, you have that thing sorting out. Going back to it, we have to recognize that where this really began was in the New Deal period and in the World War II period. Before World War II, the Jewish vote was more Republican than it was Democrat. I mean before Franklin Roosevelt, I should say. Herbert Hoover got a majority of the Jewish vote. But since World War II, having in mind that some Republicans were in America first and isolationists and the rest, since then it has just been assumed among many Jewish voters that the only respectable person to vote for is a Democratic candidate because the Republicans are not considered as pro-Israel. I may have helped a bit on that, and as I said, Reagan certainly feels that way.
You've talked about the homegrown strains of anti-Semitism in Russia and in Eastern Europe. Do you think that there is a homegrown American strain of anti-Semitism?
Oh yes, there's some, yes. And some of it is